Casey.
And I'm Corey.
And we are the Wright Brothers. I'd like to welcome you to this edition of the Tech Corner.
And in this edition, we're going to be exploring something a little bit different. We're going to be talking about the world of fonts. Something that we use every single day, but we don't really think about. Yet the difference between the correct font and the wrong font can make all the difference in the world.
Yeah, you know, it's kind of interesting. If you really think about it, about 20, 30 years ago, none of us really even knew what a font was. And the only people who dealt with fonts on a regular basis were the professionals who were paid to do so. Your graphic designers, your font setters. But today we all interact with fonts. We're all selecting fonts, we're reading fonts on an everyday basis. So the question becomes, how do we become at least somewhat experts on this topic? And that's what we're going to address today.
That's right, we got a lot of great information. Let's dive in. Alright, well, one of the things that I find really interesting about fonts is their history. Where do they come from? We never really think about that. I know that you're the graphic design expert with our company, and you know a little bit about the history of fonts that you've shared with me. Why don't you share it with our audience as well?
Yeah, I find this kind of fascinating because all of our modern life with fonts can be traced back to one small decision made back in the early 1980s. And if you think about it, you know, during the 1970s, every single computer had that ugly green console font, and that was like the only font that was on any computer. But back in the 1980s, a young little computer upstart by the name of Steve Jobs decided that on his Apple computers, and he had a complete love of fonts, and he decided that on his Apple computers he was going to put digital fonts, so people would have the option to select different fonts. Now, it was one of the things that people absolutely fell in love with about the first Apple computers, and so it's become a standard on every computer since.
That's great. So a little history about fonts. Now let's talk about selecting the right font. I know that one of the biggest considerations is legibility. We've all seen those fonts that we just can't read or they just don't make sense and they're so frustrating. How do we choose a font that's legible?
Yeah, I think in legibility there's three things I really like to think about, and it's case, space, and character. And essentially what I mean by that, a case is the idea is that lowercase letters are more legible than uppercase letters. So in general, if you're going to have a message that's important and you want it to be read and remembered, you want to use lowercase letters. And this is a bit counterintuitive because oftentimes when we think about making an important point that we want to get across, we think let's put it in caps. But I would say put it in lowercase, underline it, bold it, much better chance that's going to be read and remembered. Now the second thing that you want to think about is the spacing in between. Now when they talk about this in font terms, they talk about the counters. And the counters are those individual white spaces in between the letters. Now generally speaking, the more space there is in between individual letters, the more legible that font's going to be. So I would say if you have something, especially on a long document, you want to stay away from those fonts that seem kind of crammed together. They're going to be very difficult to read, and you can even get a headache if you're reading them over a long document. The final thing is the character. The actual character of the font. And you think about, you know, there's a big difference between what a French script A is going to look like and an Arial A is going to look like. And the difference is the character. Now, what you want to think about with the character in terms of legibility is that the closer that character is to our everyday expectations of that letter, the more legible that font's going to be. So for instance, most A's I see more closely mirror an A that I would see in an Arial font than I would in a French script in modern era. So if I wanted to put a legible font, I would probably lean towards an Arial font.
Certainly, and that deals with legibility. I know that another major aspect is matching the font to your message. Yeah. So sometimes an Arial would be very appropriate in an email or a lot of everyday messages, but if you were putting together, say, a wanted sign that you wanted to kind of have some fun with, an Arial font wouldn't be very good, so you want to find a specific font. How do you really find a font that matches your message, or what's so important to think about here?
Well, yeah, and I think that is a really important point, is that legibility is just one aspect of selecting your font. So usually when I think about legibility most is when I'm thinking about a long document, if I'm thinking about a business document, if I'm thinking about something that somebody is going to spend a lot of time with, digest a lot of information, I want to make that comfortable for them. But you're absolutely right. If you're doing marketing pieces, you're doing headlines, you're doing something where you want to grab attention, you want to find a character that's going to match that message.
Great. Now another thing that we often hear about but we don't really know what it means are serifs. Yeah. There's fonts that are sans serif or without serifs, and then serif fonts which have a big distinguishing characteristics. Why don't you talk to us about serifs a little bit?
Yeah, serifs are kind of the major dividing line between fonts. So you can really classify every font as either being a serif font or a non-serif font. And serif, I think the best way to explain it is that serifs are those little things, those little lines that are at the end of each character, and they make the font appear kind of more classical. So I think the best way to visualize this is just think about the difference between an Arial font, which has no serifs, and Times New Roman, which is a font that does have serifs. And in fact, that would be the distinguishing difference between those two fonts. They're both very legible fonts, both have very similar spacing. But the main difference are the serifs. And you can see that the difference it makes is that a Times New Roman looks like a more classical font, a more elegant font. And that is the effect that serifs have. Now the effect that taking the serifs off has is that it makes it a more informational, modern type font. And so this became very popular to do, in fact, back in the 1500s. It's kind of funny to think about
Right.
1500s being modern, but that really is the dividing line. Back in the 1500s, people started thinking, let's take the serifs off these fonts, and that's that whole movement.
Right. And so again, find a font that matches your message, whether you want serifs or not having
Exactly.
serifs. Now, I know that there's a lot of fonts that come pre-installed on the computer, but we had talked about really finding a font that meets your message. Oftentimes, you can't find that on your computer. Back to the wanted ad. If you wanted that specific old Western wanted font,
Right.
there's some places that we can go to get them on the internet. Do you have a favorite site, or is there a great place that we can go to start to get those fonts?
Yeah, I think one of the best places is a place called DA Fonts. It's just spelled out DAFONTS.com. You go there and they just have thousands of free fonts, and they're free for download for PC or Mac. So I just love that. And I just think the main note to make here, though, and there are literally hundreds of websites, and if you don't find what you like at DA Fonts, you can pay for fonts. But the important thing is just realize that those 200 or 300 fonts that you have on your computer, that is just the tip of the iceberg. Literally, some of these sites have 50,000 fonts, 100,000 fonts, and you have 200 or 300 on your computer. So you can just start to imagine you have only a small fraction of the fonts that are available out there. So if you have a special marketing piece, you don't find that font on your computer, just go Google it, go look for it.
Great. So we gave you a brief history of fonts. Hopefully we brought some excitement to them. We talked about legibility. The case, the space, and the character are the three most important things there. Find a font that matches your message. Choose if you want to use serifs or not. And then finally, we showed you a great place to find fonts. Use the internet. Start to explore your options when it comes to fonts. That's all we have for you in this edition of Tech Corner. We'd like to thank you for joining us, and we'll catch you next time.